Today on this episode of Between the Lines, a fictional political thriller which blends such real-life possibilities that we will discuss its underpinnings as nonfiction when we meet author Gary Grossman. I'm Barry Kibrick. With his latest book, Executive Treason, Gary Grossman, a former journalist, documentary filmmaker, and Emmy Award-winning television producer, delivers a page-turning mystery, one that is so filled with potentially genuine situations that it begs for serious discussion about what's going on in our world today.
I'm a writer today because I was a reader when I was 11 years old, and it was...
You do not need to prove your state of happiness to anybody.
Most of these speeches were as much as a month in preparation.
Characters, the heroes in this book, are seekers of truth in a story that involves a lot of corruption.
You don't get a chance to really talk about what's real, and it's the perfect to do.
Gary, welcome back to the show. It's a pleasure having you as a guest again. I told you in the green room, and I even told the viewers up in the beginning of the show, truly, pure fiction, it's an ultimate thriller, but our conversation is going to be about the real underpinnings that this book covers, frighteningly so, I might add. You're comfortable with that?
I'm ready. I'm absolutely ready. Thanks for having me back.
It's my pleasure. First up, literally, and again, I read it and I have to always, when I'm reading your stuff, go right back onto the web because is this real or isn't it? ANZUS, A-N-Z-U-S, Australian, New Zealand, U.S. treaty. Unfamiliar with it, especially now the relevance of it with Indonesia being so close to that area.
Isn't that interesting? So many of the elements that are in Executive Treason really fly right out of the headlines. And it's not that I know what's out there and that everything exists and everything is real, but when I get to a plot point and I want to know whether or not it has a reality underpinning to it, I not only find that there is, but there are loopholes in it, or there are concerns that we should have. I mean, who knew just a couple of months ago that we should be concerned about who's operating our ports? And yet we are. And if you were writing a novel and you go, well, you know, who's in charge of security for the ports? And you find, well, you know, it could be almost anybody. That's where reality and fiction kind of intersect, and that's what happens here.
Well, the implications, though, in particular with this has to do with Indonesia, as I said, and some of the terrorism that could easily bleed out into the Pacific
Yes.
there. And there's, again, just like you did with secession, we'll talk about that, loopholes even in the contract or the treaty, whatever you want to call it, of this ANZUS. Tell us what this actually is and where the problems actually lie.
Well, Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world. It's also the most spread out country in the world, comprised of thousands of islands. Now, how do you deal with governing those islands? I don't know. It's partially Christian, partially, or to a great extent, Indonesian Muslim. And there are warring factions. Now, for years, Indonesia was under Dutch control. Basically, everybody messed it up. Ultimately, Indonesia, now self-ruled, has its own virtually civil war, virtual civil war. So in a free world or a part of the South Pacific where there could be terrorist organizations fomenting on an island that nobody even knows about, let alone may not even have a name, what are the implications of what is happening on that island to Australia or to New Zealand or to any of the other countries in the ANZUS alliance? The United States steps in and says, wait a second, are we really aware of what could be happening when a butterfly flaps its wings 12,000 miles away? What are the implications going to be here? We have to be concerned about those kinds of implications these days.
Well, now, obviously, in this book, like you did in Executive Actions where you appeared before, you take sometimes what we think of as the far-flung potential of reality, and you bring it into a scary scenario. And let's talk about this in a second. I should what I'm going to do after this, I'm going to let you give the little blurb, just so people know what this is about, but I still say there's so much reality here, we can talk about it. The sleeper cells, maybe that'll be your segue, because like in Executive Actions, sleeper cells are very involved, And in this case, I think maybe even more realistically than even in executive actions, because we have to make a pretty big leap of faith when it came to a president being part of a sleeper cell. This has to do with players within the media and others that are not as prominently
Barry,
figured.
what do we know about the people who are expressing so much opinion on the radio these days, particularly hate radio? Whether it's conservative, right-wing radio, whether it's progressive, liberal radio, what do we know about the people? Many of them are comedians, many of them are entertainers. Many of them, if they couldn't make a living in conservative talk, but they could in progressive or liberal talk, they do it because it's about entertainment. I kind of raise that question, and I have a character, Elliot Strong, who broadcasts from the geographic center of the United States, Lebanon, Kansas. If you draw crosshairs to one corner to the other of the 48 contiguous states, you end up in a real place, Lebanon, Kansas. Population's about 300. And I have Elliot Strong, who broadcasts with a program called Strong Nation. He is a conservative talk show host going after a conservative Republican president.
Prior to that, though, and you do this thing with O'Connell from the Times?
Yes,
from the Times. He even makes these words that, could it be too American for a New York Times reporter? And I want to get into the media because so much prior to some of the conservative chat was so much of the other liberal bias.
Right.
We are so given biased information where at one time, whether it was true or not, we believed we were given just the facts. Now that's almost
now it's
never.
not true. A couple of things have changed in the last few years, literally 20 years. The fairness doctrine no longer exists. What's the fairness doctrine? It provided until 1986, 1987 the opportunity for people to come on with opposing points of view to have airtime on television programs and radio programs. If I were to make an outrageous statement about somebody in the community or somebody nationally, someone with an opposing point of view would have access to airtime, not equal time, but access to airtime. Opinion needed to be balanced. Opinion could be one-sided. And where are we today? Roughly, well, let's see, roughly 40,000 hours of programming a week is devoted to conservative talk on a local and national basis. 40,100 hours a week. On a liberal basis, it's about 3,000 hours a week. 40,000 to 3,000. It's good business for conservative talk.
But Gary, you know, and as I said, you bring it in here with the New York Times. The New York Times, much of the old media, many of the networks, you mentioned the difference between CNN and Fox, so many of them which do not total up those 3,000 hours, they have a definite liberal bias that cannot be denied. You joke about it even in the book when the reporter says, boy, I sound like I'm so American for a New York Times writer, which, by the way, is in itself very criminal. That so much of the major mass media is as biased as those talk radio stations, but just, in a sense, there almost seems more balanced now than there was at one time.
Good point. Years ago, the media, often accused of being liberal media, but the media would say, for example, when it came to Newt Gingrich, conservative firebrand Newt Gingrich today said. Well, Newt Gingrich was Speaker of the House. Probably CBS and NBC and the other networks could have just said, Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich today declared that. But they would suggest that label him, he's conservative, a firebrand, well, you know, he's just, you don't know what he basically is going to say from one minute to the next. And that kind of bias did find its way into television and radio and newspaper reporting a lot. It's perhaps a good thing, or I believe it's a good thing, that we're really not seeing that so much anymore. But it's swung way over to where a world of hate is allowed to exist.
Well, Gary, though, let's go further into this media situation. As I said, besides that, you bring out this point, and now you'll have to tell me I couldn't track this down if it's true or not. I know for a fact the consolidation of the media outlets is now really controlled by a handful of people.
Correct.
But there was a figure you gave. Let me see if I can find it quick. I'll do it. If I can, I'll just ask you it offhand. Oh yeah, here it is. Between 9 to 10,000 radio stations across the U.S. were bought and sold within a 5-year period after deregulation?
Correct.
So that's a truth now. That's a fact that's in this book.
And I'll tell you where the danger is. And I also write about it in Executive Treason. True story, but here it is, part of the fiction, part of the novel. Minot, North Dakota. There was a toxic oil spill in a few years ago, 2002, I think. The radio stations were all called when the train derailed and toxic fumes from ammonia gas were beginning to spread over Minot. Guess what? Nobody was at those radio stations. There was nobody answering the phone to be able to pick it up and to warn the people in Minot. Why? Because each of those radio stations were owned by a conglomerate, operated from 60, 70, 80, 100 miles away, and yet they still had their licenses as local radio. Some of them may have had canned programs from national hosts. Some of them may have had regional hosts. They weren't local radio stations. Local radio today is basically gone, and that's where an Elliott Strong is allowed to thrive, because there's that world of consolidation where business is really taking over. And I mean, how would they get school closings in snow? Things that we grew up with as kids.
Well, here's the other part of that that's even, in a sense, as hideous, if not worse, and that is that you got the illusion, you have this illusion that we now have 500 TV stations, satellite and digital. You have this illusion of so much media, but when it's controlled by so few hands,
right,
it is just that, an illusion.
I like to think, or I like to say that we have basically 500 TV stations. No, we have maybe 5 TV stations and 495 echoes. And that's really what the world is. Can I read a quote that I found subsequent to writing the book, but it really speaks to the issue of consolidation. American thought and American politics will be largely at the mercy of those who operate these stations, for publicity is the most powerful weapon that can be wielded in a republic. And when such a weapon is placed in the hands of one person or a single selfish group is permitted to either tacitly or otherwise acquire ownership or, as you're talking about, dominate these broadcasting stations throughout the country, then woe be to those who dare to differ with them. It will be impossible to compete with them in reaching the ears of the American people. This is from Congressman Luther Johnson from Texas. When did he say it? 1927.
Well, you know, though, here's some, I'm going to top it with one of your things. I'll tell you what you do. You give, in a sense, your, I don't want to say bad guy. There's so many bad guys in here, Gary. By the way, you're going to give the blurb about what this is about, but before, as you do, you give some of the great patriotic lines to, let's say, the badder guys, okay? Perfect example of that one, Thomas Jefferson. When the government fears the people, there is liberty. When the people fear the government, there is tyranny. Now, you're giving that quote. I got to be careful here. I don't want to give it away. You tell the story, but you gave that quote
to a talk show host.
To a talk show host. And that quote is extremely important and extremely relevant. Go ahead. Tell us the blurb.
Well, I love to see how things can be twisted. We talked before about how the media can twist things. Executive Treason is really a media story as well as a political thriller about sleeper spies. But it's the power of talk radio, the power of a talk show host, a single talk show host named Elliott Strong, and how he can influence the public opinion so much that he perhaps can bring down the presidency. But who is he trying to bring down? A conservative talk show host is actually trying to bring down a conservative president, a Republican president. Far-fetched? No. Dig back into history again. Father Charles E. Coughlin from the 1920s and 30s, socially minded priest, on the air, 30 million homes every week thanks to CBS radio. 1 in every 3 people who had a radio at that time listened to Father Coughlin. He supported Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal and his solutions for bringing the country through the Depression until he felt that Franklin Roosevelt wasn't going to represent Father Coughlin's vision of what the world should be with a national bank, that he wasn't supporting Germany, that FDR was more interested in supporting Russia. He then turned on FDR, socially minded priest on the radio, turning on a Democratic president,